My husband called my history an embarrassment and cut me from his award ceremony guest list. Then the judge presenting his award walked off stage, pointed to me, and told the room I was the informant who put my own father away. I found out I wasn't going to my own husband's award ceremony from a seating chart, not from Julian, from a seating chart forwarded to me by accident 3 weeks before the Halverson Prize Gala by a project coordinator named Deb who CC'd the wrong Cole. Subject line, Table 14, Final. 12 names under Marchetti and Cole. Mine wasn't one of them. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that ever protected me. I met Julian Cole 9 years ago at a rooftop fundraiser in Denver when I was 26 and going by my mother's maiden name and telling people I'd grown up in Ohio, which was technically true if you didn't ask which town. He was 30 and already the kind of architect who got quoted in trade magazines about honest materials. He liked that I asked good questions about cantilevers. I liked that he didn't ask any questions at all about where I came from, not for the first 4 months. And by the time he did, I'd already decided I loved the version of myself he saw when he looked at me. Clean, competent, unremarkable, a woman with a marketing job and a good eye for typefaces and no visible past. I told him the truth in pieces, the way you'd hand someone a knife handle first. My father had gone to prison when I was 19. Financial crimes. I didn't say which crimes, not that first year. Not because I was ashamed of what I'd done, but because I'd learned the hard way, in a town of 4,000 people, exactly what happens to your face in a room once people find out your last name used to be Kessler. Julian's version of the story, the one he built for himself out of the 4 sentences I gave him, was that my father had been some kind of embezzler, and I was the daughter who'd been dragged through it. Poor Naomi, rough childhood. He never asked for the court documents. I never offered them. It worked, for a while, the way a lot of things work when neither person is looking too closely. We got married on the 9th of June, 6 years ago, at a vineyard outside Sonoma with 81 guests, and Julian's mother, Corinne, took me aside during the reception, glass of Sancerre in hand, and said, "I just want you to know, sweetheart, that whatever happened before doesn't matter to this family. We don't need to discuss it, ever." She said it kindly. She said it like a gift. It took me 2 more years to understand it as the first brick in a wall. I remember the exact night I first felt the wall's outline, though I didn't have a name for it yet. It was our first Thanksgiving as an engaged couple, at Julian's parents' house in Cherry Creek, a table set for 14 with cloth napkins folded into little fans. Julian's father, Whit, a retired orthopedic surgeon with a booming laugh and no filter whatsoever, asked me over the turkey, "So, Naomi, what do your folks do?" And the table went, very briefly, silent in a way that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with Julian, who answered for me before I'd even swallowed. "Naomi's dad's not really in the picture," he said. Easy, smooth, already reaching for the gravy boat. "Her mom's terrific, though. Teaches piano." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It also wasn't anything I'd told him to say. I sat there with a forkful of stuffing halfway to my mouth and understood, dimly, that I'd just watched my fiancé edit my own biography in real time, at a dinner table, without so much as a glance in my direction to check whether the edit was one I'd have chosen. The wall went up slowly after that. That's the part people don't believe when I tell it now, that it wasn't one decision, it was 400 small ones, each so minor on its own that objecting to any single brick would have made me the unreasonable one. Brick 1, our wedding website never mentioned.
Sorry to interrupt. Real quick before the story continues. If this story hit close to home, here's the thing. Most people don't figure this stuff out until years later, after it's already cost them something. I put together the manipulation playbook so you don't have to learn it the hard way. 49 patterns, real examples, and exactly what to do the moment you spot one. It's already helped hundreds of people see clearly what took me years to figure out. Links in the description. Okay, back to what happened.
My father's name, living or dead, though it listed Julian's grandfather who died in 1994 in a full paragraph. I told myself that was normal. Grief is different from shame. Brick 2, 18 months into the marriage, at the Marchetti and Cole holiday party at the Brennan Hotel downtown, Julian introduced me to his firm's biggest client, a developer named Foster Ainsley, by first name only. "This is Naomi," he said, no surname, hand light on my back, already steering me toward the bar before Ainsley could ask a follow-up question. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone right after, out of some instinct I didn't understand yet. 7:52 p.m. Brick 3 came at the firm's spring open house, the one Marchetti and Cole throws every April to court new clients. 400 and some people moving through their converted warehouse space with wine in plastic cups. A woman named Renee, married to one of the junior architects, cornered me near the model of a library expansion and said, "Delighted? So I finally get to meet the famous Naomi. Julian's told us basically nothing about you. It's kind of hilarious. You're like a state secret." She meant it as a joke. I laughed along because that's what you do, and then I found the bathroom and sat in a stall for 6 minutes doing the thing I'd started doing by then, which was cataloging. nothing. State secret. I added it, mentally, to a list I hadn't yet admitted I was keeping. Brick 4 was smaller and somehow worse. Julian's firm had a company directory page on their website with headshots and 2-line bios for every partner, including a line for personal, spouse, kids, hobbies, the kind of humanizing filler firms like to include. Desmond's bio mentioned his wife by name and their 2 dogs. Julian's bio updated that same spring said only, Julian lives in Denver and enjoys backcountry skiing. I checked the page history using an archive tool out of pure obsessive curiosity one night in February and found that an earlier version, from 4 years back, had actually named me. Julian lives in Denver with his wife, Naomi, before someone, presumably Julian, had quietly edited it down to nothing. I sat with that for a long time. It is a strange, specific grief, finding the exact date your husband erased you from a paragraph. Brick 5, the one I actually wrote down, was 11 months ago. Julian's business partner, Desmond Farrow, who'd known him since architecture school, made an offhand joke at a barbecue about Naomi's mysterious backstory, and Julian laughed a beat too fast and said, "There's no backstory, there's just Ohio," and changed the subject to the Broncos secondary. I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad and understood, with a clarity that made my ears ring, that my husband had constructed an entire cover story for me without ever telling me he was doing it. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about that, because a lot of these stories make a wife sound braver than she was in the moment. I went home, put the leftover potato salad in the fridge, and lay awake until 2:40 a.m., doing math I hadn't done in years, the math of what it cost to be loved conditionally and whether the condition was worth meeting. The Halverson Prize is not a small thing in the world Julian lives in. It's given once a year by the Halverson Civic Foundation to a Colorado architect under 40 for a single body of work that serves the public good through design, and it comes with $60,000, a bronze medallion the size of a coaster, and, more valuable than either, a guaranteed seat at the table for every major commission in the state for the next 5 years. Julian had been trying for it since he turned 31. This was his last eligible year. He was 39. His firm's submission was the Larkspur Community Health Pavilion, a sliding-scale clinic he designed pro bono for a neighborhood in Pueblo that hadn't had a real medical building in 2 decades. It was genuinely beautiful work. I'd watched him build the model on our dining room table over 11 weekends, watched him argue with contractors about window placement because natural light mattered to people sitting in a waiting room for a diagnosis they were afraid of. I believed in that building. I believed in him. That's the part that made everything after so hard to swallow. It wasn't that I'd married a monster. It was that I'd married a man capable of building something that generous and hiding a wife that same generosity somehow never reached. The nomination came through in February. The gala was set for the second Saturday in May at the Ainsley Center downtown. 600 capacity, black tie, a room full of developers, city council members, and the kind of old Denver money that still called it the Halverson dinner instead of the gala like it was 1974. Julian told me about the nomination over dinner, practically vibrating. 10 firms, he said. It's Larkspur against 9 other projects, and I think, Naomi, I think we actually have a shot. I remember exactly what I said back because it felt like the truest thing I'd said in months. I am so proud of you I could cry. I meant it. I still mean it, actually, which is its own strange thing to carry. 3 weeks later, the seating chart landed in my inbox by accident. I didn't say anything for 4 days. I want to explain why, because it wasn't passivity, it was strategy, though I didn't fully know that yet. I'd learned at 19 years old that the worst thing you can do when you suspect someone is lying to you is announce that you suspect it. You watch, you collect, you wait until the lie is load-bearing, until removing it collapses something they can't rebuild in front of witnesses. My father taught me that in the single useful lesson he ever gave me, though he taught it to me by being the lie himself. On day 5, I asked Julian casually over coffee whether spouses were invited to the gala. "Oh, it's complicated this year," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Tables capped because of the sponsor allocations. Desmond's handling the RSVP. Complicated. Sponsor allocations." I let it sit there. 60 seconds, 90, and then I said, "Okay," and went to work. And in the parking garage at 9:14 that morning, I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. I called my friend Priya from that parking garage, actually, before I could talk myself out of it. Priya and I had known each other since our 20s, back when I was still careful about which parts of myself I let people see, and she was one of maybe 4 people alive who knew the real shape of my father's case. He said sponsor allocations, I told her, like I'm a line item that didn't make the cut. She was quiet for a second, and then she said the thing I needed someone to say out loud. "Naomi, that's not a scheduling problem. That's a decision. Those are different things, and you know it." I did know it. I just hadn't let myself say it in those words yet. That same week, at the grocery store of all places, I ran into Corinne buying flowers for a dinner party Julian and I apparently hadn't been invited to either. She hugged me, asked about my freelance work, mentioned the gala in passing. I do hope Julian wins. He's worked himself half to death over that clinic, and never once asked whether I'd be there. I stood in the floral aisle holding a bundle of ranunculus I didn't need, and understood that the not asking was its own kind of confirmation. Corinne already knew the seating had been decided. She'd probably known before I found the spreadsheet by accident. I started keeping records on the 17th of March. I have a folder now, on a drive Julian doesn't know the password to, with 14 items in it, and I'm going to tell you about them in order, because the order is the story. The first first was the seating chart itself, forwarded to my personal email before Deb could recall it. The second, 4 days later, was a screenshot of a text exchange between Julian and Desmond that I saw on his laptop, open on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. Not something I went looking for, something that was simply lit up on the screen when I walked past to get the coffee grinder. Desmond had written, "You sure about the +1s for the Ainsley table? Foster's very old school about that stuff." Julian had written back, "Yeah, keep it firm, partners and the Larkspur team only. Naomi's history isn't something I need Ainsley asking questions about the night of all nights. Naomi's history. 6 years of marriage distilled down to a 2-word liability on a seating spreadsheet." I photographed the screen with my own phone, hands steady this time, and went back to making coffee, and I did not cry until that night, alone, in the shower, with the water loud enough to cover it. The third item is a voicemail from Corinne, my mother-in-law, left for Julian, but transcribed to his phone where I saw the preview. "Just make sure the seating is handled, sweetheart. I don't want anyone at that table asking Naomi where she grew up. You know how these things get around. You know how these things get around." Corinne had never once, in 6 years, asked me a single direct question about my father. I used to think that was tact. I understand now it was reconnaissance. She knew enough of the shape of it to know exactly which parts to keep buried, and she'd decided, unilaterally, that the buried version was the one our marriage could survive. The fourth item took the longest to find, and it's the one that still makes my stomach turn over, even now. Julian keeps a cloud backup of his old phones, a habit from architecture school he told me once in case a client ever disputed the timeline on an email. I wasn't looking for anything the night I found it. I was searching his shared photo library for a picture of the two of us from our honeymoon to put in a frame for his mother's birthday. What I found instead was a folder, dated 4 years back, titled simply Millbrook, containing 6 scanned pages of the original Courier article, "The Daughter Who Turned Him In," downloaded from some regional newspaper archive, along with a screenshot of my father's now expired inmate record from the Ohio Department of Corrections website. Julian had gone looking. He'd found the surface of it, my photograph, the headline, the bare fact of a 19-year-old testifying against her father. And then, as far as I could tell from the folder's contents, stopped there. No trial transcript, no mention of the U.S. Attorney's citation, which had been covered briefly in a follow-up piece the same paper ran 8 months later. He'd found exactly enough to be ashamed and not 1 page more. The fifth item was smaller, almost funny in its pettiness if it hadn't hurt so much. An email from Julian to Desmond 2 weeks before the gala, subject line, "Seating, final, in which he'd written, "Let's just say she had a scheduling conflict if anyone from Ainsley's side asks. Simpler than getting into it." He'd already built my alibi for my own absence. He'd already decided, unilaterally, what story I'd be telling about my own life, the same way his mother had decided which parts of it were sayable in polite company. Here's the part I hadn't told Julian, the part that made his shame such a devastating misread of my life that I still, some nights, can't decide whether to laugh or scream about it. My father, Curtis Kessler, ran something called the Kessler Veterans Relief Fund out of a strip mall office in Millbrook, Ohio, from 2009 until 2015. It raised money, door-to-door, church bulletins, a booth at the county fair every August, for wounded veterans in our region, housing assistance, prosthetics, co-pays, funeral costs for guys who came home in boxes. Over 6 years, it took in just under $4.7 million from 11,000 small donors, most of them giving $20 or $50 at a time because that's what they could spare. Of that $4.7 million, federal investigators would later determine that 11%, roughly $517,000, actually reached a veteran or a veteran's family. The rest funded my father's boat, a rental property in Sarasota, and, in one detail the local paper couldn't stop repeating, a $9,000 wine cellar installed in our unremarkable ranch house on Denny Street. I found the second set of books on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after my 19th birthday, looking for a stapler in the filing cabinet in his home office, a spreadsheet, printed and hand-annotated, that didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the fund's public disclosures. It took me 11 days to understand what I was looking at. It took me another 6 weeks, sleepless and sick to my stomach most nights, to decide what to do with it. I called the FBI field office in Cincinnati on a Thursday in December. I was assigned a case agent named Renata Ojeda, who met me twice a week for 4 months at a diner off Route 9, because I was too afraid to be seen going into a federal building in a town where everybody knew my father's truck. I wore a wire twice, an old cassette-style recorder taped under a cardigan, not a movie wire, just a cheap device that shook in my hands both times, to 2 conversations with my father in which he explained, proudly, unprompted, exactly how the diversion worked. I handed over 3 years of bank statements I'd photocopied at the library, 40 cents a page, because I didn't trust the office copier at home not to log what I'd printed. I remember the second time I wore the wire more clearly than almost anything else from that year. It was a Sunday, my father's favorite day for what he called checking the books, and I sat across from him at the same kitchen table where I'd once done homework, asking him careful, half-innocent questions about the fund's numbers, while a recorder the size of a deck of cards pressed cold against my ribs under a gray cardigan. He explained the diversion to me almost fondly, like he was teaching me the family business, how the intake account fed a operations sub-account that fed, eventually, into an account with his name and only his name on it. He never once suspected the daughter across the table was the reason 2 federal agents would be at our door 11 days later. He looked that whole conversation genuinely pleased with himself. I have never been able able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't there what it does to a person, being lied to and confided in by the same man in the same breath. Agent Ojeda met me at that diner off Route 9 for the last time 3 days before the arrest, and she asked me, gently, whether I understood what was about to happen to my life once this became public in a town of 4,000 people. I told her I did. I don't think at 19 I actually did. Not the part where former friends' parents would cross the street rather than say hello. Not the part where someone spray-painted rat on our mailbox post 2 weeks after the arraignment. Not the part where I'd spend the next decade deciding, city by city, relationship by relationship, how much of my own story I could afford to say out loud. The trial was in April, 2 years after I found the spreadsheet. I testified for 1 full day and part of a second. I remember the defense attorney trying, without much success, to suggest I'd misread ordinary bookkeeping, and I remember reciting numbers back to him, the 11%, the $517,000, the $9,000 wine cellar, until he stopped asking. My father was convicted on 19 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of theft from a nonprofit organization and sentenced to 11 years, of which he served 9. The Millbrook paper ran my photograph on the front page under the headline, "The Daughter Who Turned Him In," and for about 11 days I was, depending who you asked, either a hero or the single most hated 19-year-old in a 4-county radius. I got a citation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a plain government certificate I keep in a shoebox, for what it called extraordinary civic courage in the reporting of financial crimes against vulnerable populations. I moved 400 miles away 8 months later and started introducing myself as Naomi Voss, and I have spent the 11 years since then learning, one relationship at a time, how much of that story I could afford to tell. Julian got 4 sentences. He built an entire architecture of shame on top of 4 sentences, and it never once occurred to him, not in 6 years, not over a single dinner, to ask for the blueprint. I thought about telling him. In the weeks after I found the text to Desmond, I actually drafted it twice. The first time was on a Sunday morning in April, coffee going cold between us, Julian doing the crossword, the kind of ordinary domestic quiet that used to feel like safety. I opened my mouth. I said, "Can I ask you something about the gala?" He looked up, and something in his face, a flicker of preemptive irritation, like he already knew where this was going and had already decided he was tired of it, made me close the question back down into, "Never mind, it's not important." And he said, "Okay," and went back to 17 across, and I understood in that moment that if I told him the truth right then, in that mood, on that morning, he would find a way to make it about my dishonesty for not telling him sooner, rather than his cruelty for assuming the worst without asking. The second time was 2 weeks later, at 11:40 p.m., him already half asleep, and I got as far as, "There's something about my dad I never told you," and he mumbled, not unkindly, just exhausted, "Can it wait? I have a site visit at 7, and it could wait, technically, so it waited." And I lay there in the dark, doing the same math I'd done after the barbecue, except this time landing on a different answer. There was one more scene before that decision, one I should have told first, because it's the one that actually tipped me. 3 weeks before the gala, Foster Ainsley hosted a small client dinner at his house in Cherry Hills. 8 people. A chance for the firm's biggest patron to get to know the Larkspur team before the big night. Julian brought me because this dinner, unlike the gala, had no seating chart he could quietly manage. Foster's wife had personally called to invite the Coles, both of us, by name. I watched Julian's whole demeanor change the second we pulled into the driveway. In the car, he'd coached me, gently but unmistakably, on what to say if anyone asked about my background. Just keep it light. You can say you grew up in the Midwest. Nobody needs the whole story. And I'd agreed, because I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do with everything I'd found. At the table, over a rack of lamb, Foster's business partner, a woman named Adele, mentioned she'd grown up not far from Cincinnati and asked conversationally where in Ohio I was from. I said Millbrook, and watched Julian's hand still, just slightly, around his wine glass. Adele's face did a small, curious thing, a flicker of recognition she couldn't quite place, and she said, "Millbrook. Huh, that name rings a bell. I can't think why." And Julian jumped in almost instantly with, "Small towns, right? They all start sounding the same after a while," and steered the table toward a story about a permitting dispute in Lakewood. In the car afterward, he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire dinner and said, "That was close. Close." As if my own hometown were a live wire he'd narrowly kept me from touching in front of people who mattered. I looked out the passenger window the whole drive home and didn't say a word, and that was the night I stopped drafting the conversation where I told him everything and started drafting instead the one where somebody else did. I decided, somewhere around midnight that same night, that I wasn't going to tell him. Not out of spite. Out of a colder calculation than that. I wanted to know what he would do with the truth when he had no choice but to receive it in public, in front of the exact room he'd built a whole cover story to protect. I wanted the reveal to happen to him the way the shame had been happening to me. Sourced from outside, unmanaged, no time to construct a version he'd prefer. I called Deb, the project coordinator, the following Tuesday, and told her I'd heard spouses were welcome after all, and asked sweetly whether there was room at a different table if table 14 was truly full. She said, confused, "Oh, of course there's room, honey. We've got 2 open seats at table 9. That's the Halverson board table. Would that work?" Table 9, the Halverson Foundation's own table. I said that would be lovely. I did not tell Julian I was coming. There were 3 smaller scenes in those weeks that I want to put down, because the big confrontation doesn't mean what it means without them. The first, a phone call with my mother, who still lives in Millbrook, still still goes by Kessler because she never remarried and never saw the point in running from a name that had already found her once. I told her about the seating chart. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "You know, your father used to say the same thing about you at the trial. Called you an embarrassment to his lawyer right there in the hallway before you testified. Called you that to your face, if I recall." I hadn't remembered that specific word until she said it. Embarrassment. It's a strange thing, hearing the exact insult land twice in one lifetime, from two different men who each thought they had the moral high ground looking down at me. The second, a sleepless night in late April, 3:15 a.m., and where I pulled up the old Millbrook Courier archive on my laptop and reread my own testimony transcript for the first time in 9 years, 22 pages, my 19-year-old self answering a prosecutor's questions in complete, careful sentences about diverted checks and a wine cellar, and I cried not because it was sad, but because I recognized her. Recognized how much braver she'd been at 19, alone, with no husband and no safety net, than I'd been at 32, married, comfortable, still too scared to say 4 sentences out loud at my own kitchen table. The third, an aborted confrontation exactly 9 days before the gala, in the car, on the way home from his mother's house, where I finally said, flatly, "I know you told Desmond to keep me off the Ainsley table because of my history." Julian's hands tightened on the wheel. "That's not, where did you even hear that?" he said. And I said, "Does it matter where?" And he said, "Naomi, it's a work thing. It's not personal. Can we please not do this 3 miles from my mother's driveway?" And I let it go, because I was 3 miles from his mother's driveway, and because I already had a better room picked out for this conversation than the front seat of a Volvo. The gala was on a Saturday, the second week of May, at the Ainsley Center. 640 guests according to the program, string quartet in the lobby, the Larkspur model displayed on a lit pedestal near the entrance where every arriving guest had to walk past it. I got there early, on purpose, in a navy dress I'd bought without telling him, and gave my name at the check-in table with a steadiness that surprised me. The coordinator scanned the list, found Cole N. Table 9, and handed me a place card with a small, unbothered smile. No idea she was handing me the last piece of a plan 6 weeks in the making. I watched Julian arrive 40 minutes later from across the lobby, tuxedo pressed, nervous in the specific way he only got before something he'd worked toward for years, laughing at something Desmond said, scanning the room the way he always did at these things, checking angles, checking who was near whom, and I understood, watching him, that he was running a version of tonight in his head where I simply didn't exist, where the seams he'd spent months sewing shut held all the way through. Dessert. He did not see me. Not once, through cocktail hour, through the first course, through the opening remarks from the Foundation's executive director, though he passed within 20 feet of table 9 twice, glass in hand, entirely unaware that the woman he'd spent 3 years managing out of visibility was sitting in plain sight the whole time, 3 seats down from a judge who remembered her name. I sat between a retired city planner named Otis and a woman in her 60s with silver hair cropped close and a formidable, watchful stillness about her, whose place card read, "The Hon Miriam Ashworth." She introduced herself as a judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals and asked politely what brought me to table 9. I said my husband was one of the nominees. She asked which project. I said the Larkspur Pavilion. She said, "That's the one out of Pueblo, isn't it? I toured it in March. Beautiful work." I said thank you, and meant it on Julian's behalf, and did not yet know that in 90 minutes this woman would be the one to end my marriage in front of 640 people. Dinner service finished around 8:40. The lights dimmed for the awards portion. 9 finalists were called up one at a time for brief remarks before the winner's announcement. A formality, a chance for the room to hear from each firm. Julian was 4th. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and I watched him from table 9, 40 feet away, talk for 90 seconds about the Larkspur Clinic, about honest materials and natural light, and a neighborhood that had waited 20 years for someone to build them something that took their health seriously. He was good. He was genuinely good at this. I clapped along with the room and felt, underneath the ache, something that was still, stupidly, pride. Judge Ashworth was the one presenting the Larkspur firm's segment introduction, a rotating honor among board members, I'd later learn, and this year hers. She stood, walked to the podium after Julian finished, and began her remarks the way everyone else had, warm and general, about the Foundation's mission and the caliber of this year's finalists. Then she stopped. I watched it happen in real time, watched her gaze travel out over the room and land, and hold, on table 9, on me, and something crossed her face that I can only describe as recognition arriving 9 years late. She paused for what felt, in the room, like an uncomfortably long silence, maybe 4 full seconds, and then she said, into the microphone, in a voice that carried to the back wall without any strain at all, "I'm going to depart from the script for a moment, if the Foundation will forgive me." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when they sense something is about to happen that wasn't on the program. "Before I was a judge," she said, "I spent 11 years as an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Ohio, and in 2015, I prosecuted a fraud case involving a fake veterans charity that stole over $4 million from working families who could least afford to lose it." She let that sit. "We won that case, and 11 veteran families who'd been denied benefits they were owed got restitution because a 19-year-old girl walked into an FBI field office with a shoebox of bank statements and wore a wire twice, alone, against her own father, at an age when most people can't be trusted to keep a job." She looked directly at table 9. "I am looking at that woman right now. She's sitting 3 seats down from me. Her name back then was Naomi Kessler, and I have thought about her courage more times in the last past 9 years than I can count, and I did not expect tonight to get the chance to say this to her directly, in front of a room full of people, but I am not going to waste it. 640 people turned to look at me. I found Julian's face across the room. I want to describe exactly what happened to it, because I've replayed it more times than is probably healthy. First, confusion. Genuine. His brow furrowing like the words hadn't parsed. Second, maybe 2 seconds later, the specific drain of color that happens when confusion resolves into understanding. Third, his eyes finding mine across the room, and something in them that I can only call pleading. Not for me, I don't think, but for this not to be happening in front of Foster Ainsley, who was seated at his own table not 15 feet from him, phone already half raised. I stood up. I don't fully know why. Instinct, maybe. Or the same 19-year-old steadiness Judge Ashworth had just described coming back online after 9 years of dormancy. And I said, into a room that had gone almost perfectly silent, "Thank you, Your Honor. I didn't expect this tonight either." Julian was moving toward me now, weaving between tables, and I watched Desmond grab his arm and say something low that I couldn't hear, but could guess the shape of, "Not here, not now." And Julian shook him off and kept coming, and reached table 9 with his face doing something between a smile and a wince, and said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "Naomi, sweetheart, I had no idea. This is incredible, actually. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" Denial dressed up as delight. That was stage 1, and it lasted about 11 seconds before Foster Ainsley, 3 tables away, said, not quietly at all, "Cole, isn't this the wife you kept off my table because of her history?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. Julian's smile didn't so much fall as evaporate. That was about logistics," he said, stage 2 now, minimizing, his voice climbing half an octave. "The seating was tight, Foster. You know how the sponsor tables get capped. It wasn't. You told Desmond her history wasn't something you needed me asking questions about," Foster said. He wasn't performing outrage, exactly. He looked more like a man doing arithmetic he didn't love the answer to. "I've got the text. Desmond forwarded it to me in March when I asked why your wife wasn't on the RSVP because I thought it was strange. I hadn't known that. I filed it away." Desmond had shown someone else, which meant the humiliation Julian had spent months trying to contain had already leaked past every wall he'd built, weeks before I even sat down at table 9. Julian turned to me, and stage 3 arrived, blame, aimed sideways, the oldest move there is. "You could have told me who your father actually was," he said, and his voice had an edge in it now, something almost accusatory, like I was the one on trial. 6 years, Naomi. 6 years, and I got 4 sentences about financial crimes. What was I supposed to do with that? I let you believe nothing," I said, and I was surprised by how level my own voice came out, because inside I was shaking hard enough that I could feel it in my back teeth. "You built the rest yourself. You never asked a single follow-up question in 6 years, Julian. Not one. You decided what shape my shame should take, and then you spent our entire marriage making sure it fit in a box small enough that Foster Ainsley would never see it. That is not fair," he said, too loud now, the whole room frankly and openly listening. You were protecting yourself," I said. "There's a difference, and I think everyone at this table can hear it." That was the break. I watched it happen. Watched the exact second the performance he'd been running, for me, for the room, for Foster Ainsley, simply gave out under its own weight. His shoulders dropped. His face did something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen since the early days. Back before I was a liability. Back when I was just a woman who asked good questions about cantilevers. I didn't think of it like that," he said, quietly now, mostly to himself. And for one strange second, I almost felt sorry for him, watching a man realize in real time, in front of 640 witnesses, that the story he'd told himself about his own decency had a hole in it the size of me. Around us, the room hadn't gone back to its own conversations the way rooms usually do once the initial shock passes. People were still watching, openly now, some of them not even pretending otherwise. I saw Renee, the architect's wife from the open house, hand pressed to her mouth. I saw Otis, the retired city planner from table 9, lean toward Judge Ashworth and say something I couldn't hear, and the judge nod once, grim and satisfied in the way of someone who'd just watched a piece of evidence land exactly where she'd aimed it. Desmond had gone very still at his own table, and when I caught his eye, he looked away first. He'd been the one who forwarded the text to Foster. Whether out of guilt or self-preservation, I never did find out, and I think some part of him understood, in that moment, that his own quiet complicity was about to become a permanent footnote in the story, too. Foster Ainsley hadn't finished. That surprised me most of all. I'd expected him to enjoy the spectacle and move on, but he actually stood, glass still in hand, and said to Julian, loud enough for 3 tables to hear clearly, "I've worked with you for 6 years, Cole. I've had you in my home, and you decided the woman who did that," he gestured almost violently toward the podium, toward Judge Ashworth, "was the liability. Not the $400,000 I watched a different client hide from his own board last spring. Her." He shook his head, set the glass down harder than he needed to, and said, "I'm going to need a minute to figure out what I think about that," and walked toward the bar, leaving Julian standing there with nothing left to perform for. Julian turned back to me. Whatever was left of the confident, tuxedoed man who'd given a 90-second speech about honest materials 40 minutes earlier had gone entirely. "Naomi," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable of my name, something I hadn't heard it do since his father's funeral 3 years before. "I need you to know I never thought of you as an embarrassment. I thought I was protecting you. You told told Desmond I was your history. I said, not your wife, your history. Like I was a line item you'd already closed out. I kept my voice even, mostly because I could feel, underneath it, a scream that had been building for 6 years, and I didn't trust what would happen if I let even a fraction of it out in front of 600 people. You don't protect someone by deciding on your own which parts of their life are safe to let the room see. You just decide for both of you what shape their shame gets to take. That's not protection, Julian. That's curation. He didn't have an answer for that. I remember the silence more than anything else. How long it stretched. How the string quartet, which had started up again near the bar during the confusion, suddenly sounded very far away. Judge Ashworth, still at the podium, let the moment breathe for exactly as long as it needed, and then said, gently but with unmistakable finality, I think we should let the Coles finish this conversation somewhere more private. Larkspur Community Health Pavilion, ladies and gentlemen. The extraordinary piece of work, whatever else is true tonight. The room applauded, uncertain, grateful for permission to look away. They announced the winner 40 minutes later. It wasn't Larkspur. I don't think Julian, by that point, was even fully registering the loss. I want to tell you what happened in the parking garage afterward, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. Julian caught up with me at my car, tie loosened, jacket over one arm, and said, can we talk about this like adults? And I said, we are talking about it like adults, Julian. This is what it looks like when I stop managing your comfort. And he said, quieter. I'm sorry. I don't know how I let it get that far. And I believed that he meant it. In the moment, the way people mean things right after the floor has dropped out from under them. I told him I needed to think, and I drove to Priya's apartment and slept on her couch, and I did not go home for 6 days. Those 6 days matter, so I'll give them their own space. On the second day, Julian texted 41 times, most of them apologies, a few of them, later on, edging back toward the blame shift, asking why I'd let him walk into that blind. On the fourth day, he showed up at Priya's building unannounced, and she stood in the doorway and told him, not unkindly, that Naomi would call him when she was ready, and he left without arguing, which surprised me. I think some part of him already understood by then that the version of the story where he was blindsided had stopped holding weight. On the 6th day, I went home, not because I'd forgiven him, but because I needed my own kitchen table to think at, and we sat across from each other for 3 hours, and I watched him try, genuinely try, to understand what he'd done, and watched him keep sliding, every 20 minutes or so, back into some version of, but if I'd known. That sliding is the thing I couldn't get past in the end, not the original 6 bricks. The fact that even after the whole wall had come down in front of 600 people, some part of him still wanted the blueprint to be my fault for not handing it over sooner. It's been 14 months since the gala. Julian and I separated 11 weeks after that night. Once it became clear over a series of increasingly honest conversations that his sorrow, real as it was, kept circling back to how the room had reacted rather than to what he'd actually done to get us there. The divorce was finalized in February. Larkspur opened to the public in March, and I drove out to Pueblo by myself the week after, walked through the waiting room with its good light, and let myself feel proud of it without needing to feel anything about him. Desmond called me once, in April, out of the blue, and apologized, clumsily, at length, for forwarding the text to Foster without thinking through what it would mean for me if it ever surfaced. I told him it didn't matter anymore, which wasn't entirely true, but it felt like the kinder thing to say to a man who was, in his own limited way, trying. Corinne has not called. I don't expect her to. I think, in the end, she'd rather the wall had simply stayed up, and some part of her still blames me for the night it came down, as if Judge Ashworth's microphone were something I'd engineered rather than something I'd simply, finally, stopped preventing. Judge Ashworth and I have coffee every few months now, an odd, unexpected friendship built out of one impossible night. She helped me connect with a nonprofit that trains whistleblowers navigating fraud cases involving family members, and I've spoken twice now, to small rooms, about what it actually costs to do the right thing at 19 and then spend a decade hiding that you did it. My government citation is out of the shoebox. It's framed on the wall of my new apartment, above a small green desk where I do my freelance work now. Mornings, coffee going cold the way it used to at that dining room table, except nobody's waiting for me to be smaller. My father is still in Ohio, out on parole since March, and he's written me 4 letters since his release that I haven't opened. I don't know yet if I ever will. That part of it isn't finished, and I've stopped pretending it needs to be, for anyone's tidy ending but my own. I ran into Renee, the architect's wife from the open house, at a coffee shop in August, and she hugged me for a long time and said she thought about that night at the gala more than she'd expected to, that it had made her go back and reread her own marriage a little more carefully. I don't know what she found there. I didn't ask. I've learned this past year that not every thread needs pulling all the way to the end to be worth noticing. Last Tuesday evening, I sat at that green desk folding laundry with a window open, nobody's seating chart to check, nobody's version of me to maintain, and I thought, not for the first time, that it took a stranger with a microphone to say the truest sentence anyone had said about me in 9 years, and that I'd rather be the woman a judge remembers than the wife a husband edits. Anyway, that's the story. If you want more like this one, the full thing's linked below, and I've got a whole channel of these if you're into it. I'll see you in the next one.